Hello, and welcome to Mystic Dog Mama, the podcast for soul-led dog mamas, where you'll discover how to best nourish your dog and yourself, mind, body, and soul. I'm your host, Dr. Alexia Meller. Thank you so much for being here with me. Today, we're diving into a topic that's often charged with emotion, confusion, and concern: vaccinations. And we're doing it with clarity, compassion, and grounded science, thanks to our guest, integrative veterinarian and homeopath, Dr. Lise Hansen. In this episode, we unpack what vaccines actually do in the body, why the idea of boosting immunity every year doesn't hold up, and what titer testing is, and how it might offer a more thoughtful alternative to routine vaccination. We also explore the nuance when you do want to vaccinate, which vaccines are truly essential, and how to support your dog if vaccination is needed, including ways to gently support the detox process afterward. Plus, we answer some of the most common community questions that I get here about non-core vaccines like Lyme, Leptospirosis, and Bordatella. If you've ever felt unsure about making the quote-unquote right decision around vaccines for your dog, this conversation is here to meet you in that place. Not with fear or judgment, but with curiosity, informed insight, and deep respect for both science and the sacred bond that you share with your dog. Dr. Lise and I talk about practical, proactive things that you can do to make sure that you're able to have thoughtful and productive conversations with your vet about vaccinations. And to help support you with that, Stacy Renfrey and I have created a free downloadable PDF as part of our brand new Fetch Starter Pack. It's called Bridging the Gap: Confident Vet Conversations for Holistic Dog Guardians. And its aim is to do just that: help you tap into your confidence and come away from vet visits knowing that you're making right decisions from a place of love, not fear. It includes suggested questions that you can ask when you're first looking for a vet, questions you might want to ask in a vet visit, and how to handle a diagnosis conversation, as well as how to make space for your own big feelings that accompany any vet visit. We think you're going to love it, and it sits beautifully with our other free resources in our Fetch Starter Pack that are all designed to help you live holistically, happily, and healthily with your dog. You can download our starter pack for free at learnfetch.com. And another resource that you just might love is our Fetch Summer Almanac, available now on our learnfetch.com shop. Summer invites expansion, joy, and connection. But for our dogs and ourselves, it can also bring heat, overwhelm, and restlessness. The Fetch Summer Almanac is your seasonal compass. Rooted in traditional Chinese medicine and created through the lens of dog guardian connection, this guide offers cooling foods, daily rituals, heart-centered practices, and space to reflect, so both you and your dog can move through summer with more ease, rhythm, and presence. This isn't a how-to for doing more. It's a gentle invitation to do less, but with more intention, more listening, more softness, and more joy. It's now available as a downloadable PDF, the first in our new seasonal living series. You can buy your copy and begin your solstice-aligned journey today. The investment is only £7, and it's available on our online shop at learnfetch.com. I've left the link in the show notes. Okay, on that note, let's go. Dr. Lise Hansen, thank you so much for joining us on the Mystic Dog Mama podcast today. I'm so excited to have you back and so excited to dive into this topic of vaccines and titer tests with you.
Thank you for inviting me. Yes, it's great to be here again.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine. And I have to say, when I let the word out to my community on Mystic Dog Mama, as well as into our Fetch First Light community, when I said that I was going to be speaking to you about this topic, there were loads of questions that started to flood in, because I think this is probably one of the biggest topics for pet parents to have to navigate. And it's a topic where there's a lot of pressure coming from multiple sides. There's legal issues. There's all kinds of questions about how we actually navigate this. And so I think it's great that we're going to get to do a deep dive into this and hopefully give people some really helpful takeaways for how they can approach this topic for themselves and for their dogs. But I wanted to start off by asking you, because I think this is probably a really useful place for us to start, which is what are vaccines actually, and what the kind of mechanism of a vaccine? What is it doing in the body?
Yeah, that's a very good place to start. There are different types of vaccines, but just on a fundamental level, what you do when you vaccinate someone is you give a weakened a little bit of a disease. You give a little bit of disease matter. It could be a viral disease. It could be a bacterial disease. Some of them are live, but weakened. Some of them are killed. Some of them are more artificially produced. But the principle is that you give a small amount of disease matter so that you introduce it to the individual's immune system so that they get to know that particular disease and their immune system gets to prepare and gets to make the antibodies, just learn about this disease so that if it is ever encountered in real life in its true virulent form, you're prepared and you're more likely to, well, to survive ultimately, but you will either not be sick at all or you'll get a weaker version of the disease. So you're showing a disease to an immune system so that it will be prepared if it ever meets it again.
Okay, perfect. Because I think that's helpful to understand why would we be giving it in the first place, and then what are we expecting from it. And I think one of the questions that was coming up quite a bit in the community is around this notion of quote unquote boosting the immune system with a booster. And I wondered if you could kind of chat about that as well.
It's Can I start even earlier just to say
Yeah.
that when we talk about vaccines and boosters, it's very important always to specify which vaccines are we actually talking about, because it's easy to make it into a discussion of vaccines, just as a big kind of undefined um, thing. And then people almost define themselves as being pro or anti-vaccines, and it becomes a very, very uninformed and unhelpful argument very quickly. It is absolutely prudent to be careful about vaccines and to be skeptical about vaccines, but it's silly to be against vaccines as a whole. It's as silly, in my opinion, to be against vaccines as it is, which you can meet sometimes, particularly sadly in health professionals, the attitude that vaccines are all good and completely safe, and you can, the more the better. I mean, either of those polarized arguments are not unhelpful and potentially dangerous. So I think when we talk about vaccines, we need to be very specific and talk about which vaccine are we talking about now? What are we talking about? Because there is an argument in veterinary medicine, certainly, where the world leading experts on vaccination are the professors who have written the World Small Animal Veterinary Association vaccination guidelines, and they are very rude about the word booster. Saying that it's a nonsense from the get-go. There is no such thing, because booster implies that you have something that's kind of waning and then you boost it and then it goes up again and then it drops and then you boost it. And certainly for most of the diseases that we vaccinate against, and the core diseases that we shall return to, I'm sure, that all dogs should be vaccinated against. The long-time president of that vaccine expert group, I mean, quite famously, he's got it's almost like a stand-up set he does about the word boosting, saying, it's complete nonsense. There is no such thing. You cannot boost a vaccine. What he says, to quote him directly, is that being protected against, if you're a dog, protection against the core vaccines is akin to pregnancy, in the sense that it's a yes-no state. You're either protected or you're not protected. And if you're halfway pregnant, you can't suddenly become, it's a yes or no thing. It's a binary thing. And if you are protected against the core vaccines, the core diseases, then repeating the vaccine adds nothing. And that's why the word boost is outdated, really. And when you hear it used, I would always encourage anyone who hears that word to be a little bit skeptical and make sure that, what are we actually talking about? Because if you are unprotected and you get a core vaccine, then you will become protected. But you're not boosting anything because you were unprotected to begin with. And if you are already protected and you repeat the vaccine, you gain nothing. So boosting is a really interesting word that's, waved around a lot. And there may be some diseases. I hear it used in human medicine, and I'm not really qualified to comment on that. So there may be some situations where you can use that term where protection drops and then you can make it go up again. But certainly the diseases that it's really important to address when we talk about dog health, the core diseases, boosters are out. You're either protected or you're not protected. And once you are protected, all the science points to that protection being lifelong, certainly many years, 9, 10 plus years. So this idea of regular boosters for dogs, when we're talking about the core vaccines, is a nonsense.
Right. Right. No, that's really helpful. So maybe it's a good time to actually talk about what the core vaccines are. What are the core concerns, and what are the appropriate, I guess, measures for like when they should be given, and the kind of protocols for that? And how would you know whether or not your dog actually is protected? How do we actually understand that?
Oh, you're kindly you're leading me to my pet topic, which is the titer test, which is this test that we can do in each individual dog, where, I mean, we're just in this fantastic, lovely position now that we don't have to argue about how often an individual dog needs a vaccine, but we can just check, and the test that we have available to us is the so-called Titre test or titer test, depending on where you're from, which is a blood test that measures antibodies. And as we said before, what you do when you vaccinate is you give a little bit of the disease so that the body can produce antibodies. And those antibodies are there in the bloodstream, and a simple blood test can measure them and therefore answer the question, is this dog protected having had this vaccine? Yes or no? And when we do these blood tests, they are fully validated. I mean, the experts have said for more than a decade now, probably closer to 2, that this is the best way to go in a veterinary practice, is to, if you're in doubt about whether or not a dog is protected from a former core vaccine, regardless of when it was given, do a blood test, find out. And if the blood test is negative, do the vaccine, and if it's not, then the dog is fully protected. Back to this thing that it's an all or nothing state, being protected or not being protected. So to answer your question, the core vaccines in dogs are it's kind of a trinity. They tend to come together both in the vaccine and when we do the titer test. The 3 core diseases are parvovirus, distemper, and hepatitis. And hepatitis is sometimes also called adenovirus. But those 3 are the ones that globally, really, all dogs should be protected against. And luckily, they are also the ones that give long-lasting protection, so that when a pup or a young dog has reacted to the puppy vaccines and formed these antibodies, there's no reason to expect them to drop. But we don't have to expect or guess. We can just check this by doing regular titer testing. And I should add that there is some geographical differences. There are some places in the States where you also need to consider rabies a core vaccine. But generally speaking, those are the 3 ones that all dogs must have, should be protected against.
And what is a protocol that you would recommend then for when a dog should get that? And because I know that also varies as well according to like how old the dog should be. Should there be spaces in between, all of that? Because a lot of people have concerns as well about giving multiple vaccines in one go. So I wondered what your thoughts on that would be.
It has been established for sure that vaccine side effects are seen more. There are certain risk factors and non-risk factors, and one of them is when we give more than one, the more vaccines we give at the same time, the more risky the whole business becomes and the more overwhelming it can be for the immune system. So ideally, we'd want to give them one at a time, but we're limited by the fact that most of these vaccine products aren't available. It varies from country to country and between vaccine manufacturers, so it's always worth asking. But the core vaccines generally come as a trinity, these three vaccines together. And they are also not the vaccines that tend to cause problems. So I'm not sure it is an issue, but it can be frustrating, particularly if you have a titer test that's negative on one of them and you end up having to repeat them all because you can't get that one as a single vaccine. But in terms of when you give them, the basic advice would be that once a dog has reacted, once a dog has achieved immunity, I would never repeat them without doing a titer test first. And if your dog is never boarded, if you don't go to shows or training classes or anything where they ask for certificates, then my personal feeling would be that it would be absolutely safe to just have the first vaccine, have a positive titer test, and then forget about it. This dog is now protected. It's quite reasonable to assume that this dog is now protected for life. But if you would like to double check, and if you need a certificate to show in any, I mean, there's a sort of quite a good standard of care in most places now that would like to see a vaccination certificate, and thankfully all of these places will also be quite happy, maybe even prefer to see a titer test certificate. And in that case, it will be every 3 years. There's no point in repeating a titer test more often than every 3 years, but it's a reasonable approach to protection in dogs against the core diseases would be to have the first ones titer test maybe every 3 years or less, and then not ever repeat the vaccines unless the titer test is negative.
Right.
And what I'm skirting around here is the first ones. And I don't know whether you want to go into the puppy vaccines now or whether we should save it for later, because that gets a little more in depth, really, because this whole thing about when do we give the puppy vaccines and how often do we give the puppy vaccines. Going back when I was a young vet in practice, we gave them twice, typically at 8 and 12 weeks. Then there was research saying some of them may not react to that, so we should give at 8, 12, and 16 weeks. And the latest advice as of last year is that we should add a fourth puppy vaccine at 6 months. So the sort of standard approach now is that puppies should have the puppy vaccines at 8, 12, 16, and whatever that is, 26 weeks, 6 months. The reason for that, the interesting thing about that is that there is, a puppy always only responds to one of them. There's only one injection of core vaccines given to an unprotected animal will give long-lasting protection on its own, probably for life. The problem is that puppies are puppies are protected by their mothers, the passive immunity that they get through the colostrum in the first day or two of life, where the mother passes on some of her antibodies. This is often referred to as passive immunity or maternally derived antibodies. And these are antibodies that circulate in the puppy, but are not made by the puppy's immune system. So they have a sell-by date. They're just to protect the puppy until the immune system matures and is able to, they're able to do it for themselves. And the complication of this is that if you vaccinate a puppy that still has his or her mother's antibodies present and active in their system, they will do exactly what they're supposed to do, and they will go in and act against that bit of disease that comes in from the outside, which means that the vaccine will not get a chance to interact and to stimulate the puppy's immune system. So in effect, the mother's antibodies will block the vaccine. And that's the only reason why we give a series of puppy vaccines. It's kind of, sometimes I call it carpet bombing, but it is a little bit, because we don't know, if we can find out if we want to. But if we don't do that, we can't know. We can't tell by looking at the pup, when are you going to be ready to be vaccinated? When are your mother's antibodies going to be gone to the extent that the vaccine will be able to have an effect and do what it's supposed to do? All we know is that this happens somewhere between 7, 8 weeks of age and 16 weeks of age. So that's a big span. which is why we do this. Vaccinate at 8, 12, 16, and weeks and 6 months, because most of them will be able to respond to the 12th week vaccine, but some of them will be able to respond already at 8 weeks, and some of them will have received so many strong antibodies from their mother that they will still be protected by 16 weeks, and won't, therefore can't be vaccinated until they're 16 weeks. And again, when I say vaccinated, I really mean immunized, because when you vaccinate someone, you're just giving them an injection with a vaccine. When you immunize something, that describes them receiving a vaccine and the vaccine interacting with the immune system in a way that you were intending it to do. So you may vaccinate the puppy at 8 weeks and 12 weeks, but if it's very well protected by its mother's antibody, you may not be able to immunize it until it's 16 weeks. And the reason for the recent addition of the 6-month vaccine is that there is a very, very, very tiny proportion that may even have their mother's antibodies strong and present until they're 20 weeks, 21 weeks. And that's why that last one is added on. It will do nothing in the vast majority of puppies, but it's just to make sure that all puppies end up being immunized. The way, if you want to do this more elegantly, maybe you can titer test puppies, because you can do, obviously you can identify antibodies in their bloodstream. What you can't do is say whether the puppy made them or the mother made them. You can just, if you take a blood test from a 12-week-old puppy, say you buy a puppy from the breeder at 8 weeks and it's just had the first vaccine, and then you would rather not give 3 more, you can go to a vet at 12 weeks and have a titer test done. But if that titer test is positive, all it means is there's no point in vaccinating today. There are antibodies present, so there's absolutely no benefit from vaccinating today. But you can't know whether these are from the 8-week vaccine or whether they are passive immunity passed on from the mother. So you'd have to titer test again. And typically we say when the puppy, after 16 weeks, it becomes very, very likely that that it's the puppy's antibodies. We used to say just do it after 16 weeks. Just in the last year or so, we've started saying, well, maybe do it at 6 months. Then you're completely sure that there is no way, if there are antibodies present, they're from the pup's own immune system. But once you understand all of this, it becomes clear that there are lots of different approaches.
Right.
Because it also depends on, have you got a Saint Bernard puppy that lies on the vet's table and wags its tail and accepts treats and couldn't care less that you do a blood test? Because in that case, there's a good argument for just saying, well, don't vaccinate at all until the titer test becomes negative. Then you only have to give 1 vaccination. But if you have a tiny little, very nervous pup where it's harder to take a blood test, and it may be traumatizing to that pup to have to do that at that age, particularly have to do it repeatedly, then I also think it's a reasonable argument to say, well, we don't want a dog that's scared of vets for the rest of his or her life, so maybe we'd rather give an extra vaccine that may not be needed. So there are lots of different ways you can navigate that.
Right.
Once you understand the sort of fundamentals of how it works. But the main point is that a pup only responds to 1.
Right.
And if you give it too soon, you risk you can have a pup that's been vaccinated 2 or 3 times, but never been immunized. And that's the risk. So if in a, I don't know, hypothetical scenario where you only have 1 vaccine, you only have 1 injection to give to that pup, you want to give it when it's on the older side of 4 months old for sure, because that's when you're sure it's going to work. You wouldn't want to give it to an 8-week-old puppy.
Right. And what do you think about in terms, I think one of the concerns that I've heard from pet parents as well, and it kind of points to what you were just referring to about the size of the dog, even that in general, it's the same amount of vaccine that's being injected into a 4-pound Chihuahua that is, being injected into a Great Dane, and the concerns around that. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, and whether or not it is possible to ask your vet to apply a different amount. Is that a reasonable request?
It's not, because there is, I mean, I suppose you could try and then titer test to see if it worked.
Hmm.
But I mean, immunologists agree that being receptive to disease is not relative to your size. So that the amount of disease matter in a vaccine is the same. Doesn't matter whether you're big or small. I mean, you could, it's going to sound a bit silly, but it's like if someone sneezes at you in a bus, are you going to need to be sneezed on more if you're big and fat, an adult, than if you're a small child? You know, it's infection is, it is believed that an infectious agent will infect when there's enough of it, regardless of the size of the recipient or the patient. So protection is not, it's not related to the size of the individual. But what it does mean, what we see clearly, is that we see side effects from vaccination happening much, much more in there are some known risk factors, and they are definitely the size of the dog. You know, smaller dogs suffer much more from vaccine side effects than big dogs do. Young dogs suffer, puppies suffer much more than older dogs do. There are more incidents when lots of vaccines are given together, and there are more incidents from the killed vaccines than from the live vaccines. And then, of course, when that all comes together in a perfect storm, where you have a tiny, you know, a very young dog of a tiny breed being given a cocktail of 7 deadly diseases, maybe including rabies or leptospirosis, that are the 2 killed vaccines in common use. And so you can, there's a lot you can do to try and lower the risks just by spreading out the vaccines, delaying some of them to the pup is older, if you want to give them at all. There's lots of things you can do, but giving a smaller amount of the vaccine itself is quite likely not to give any protection.
Right. Right. No, that's helpful to know. And I wonder too, we are going to get you mentioned the leptospirosis. I do want to ask you specifically about that in a second, but I also wanted to ask you about the possibility of nosodes. I know in this community in particular, that's something of interest as well, whether or not that is a suitable alternative to vaccines, what your thoughts are on that.
I think that's a really good question. Um, and as with, you know, as often is the case with good questions, there's no short answer. But I mean, I'm a homeopath, so I think there is a place for nosodes, but I also think the need for nosodes is a lot less if you understand the basic science of vaccines, because actually you can protect a dog with, I mean, like we said before, you can protect a dog for life with 1 vaccine against the 3 core diseases given at the right time. And you can help identify the right time through titer testing. So I think using nosodes against the 3 core diseases, parvovirus, distemper, and hepatitis, is silly and probably dangerous, to be honest, because we have safe, effective vaccines and you can protect fully with very little risk, because you don't have to keep giving all these boosters that as we used to call them. So I think for the core vaccines, I don't think boosters have a role to play at all. Sorry, nosodes have a role to play at all. I think vaccinating in a knowledgeable way will do the job with absolutely minimal risk. And the thing about dog vaccines is that the core vaccines are really the only vaccines that most dogs need. So I'd be quite happy to give the minimal amount using titer testing, give the minimal amount, you know, 1 or at least few doses of the core vaccine, and know that my dog is protected. So there isn't much of a role for nosodes in that connection. Nosodes have a place, and where I use them is when there are outbreaks of something really contagious, and that tends to be kennel cough. Yeah, and you know, if there's a boarding kennel, or if dogs are going to shows and they come back, and you know, it's sort of, you get the messages that everyone's coming down with kennel cough, having been to that show or been to that show ring. Kennel cough nosode, absolutely. You know, in that sort of situation where you know there's exposure, get it in there. That's the sort of situation where I would use it. And we know that nosodes don't give antibody response. So it would be unlikely I mean, it doesn't seem reasonable to expect that a nosode would give lasting protection. But if you've been exposed today or yesterday or the day before and you take nosodes now, definitely it'll work. There's several papers showing that. Some dog owners are very worried about leptospirosis, and I know I have colleagues who think, oh, well, in that case, take a leptospirosis nosode or give a leptospirosis nosode every now and then. I'm not convinced by that, partly because I hate to give advice that isn't based on some sort of scientific evidence, and there is no evidence to support that working. We know there are no antibodies, and how often would you give it? You know, if the thing about the leptospirosis threat is that it's hugely exaggerated. And if you want, I mean, you could give, if you wanted to give a dog a leptospirosis nosode every day or every week or every month, it would seem to me to be based on very little. If your neighbor's dogs were sick with leptospirosis, absolutely, I would take lots of leptospirosis nosode. Or if you've been to the vet clinic and the dog there had leptospirosis recently, or, you know, if there was any kind of known exposure, I would do it. But I wouldn't do it as a sort of general long-term background protection. I wouldn't, partly because I wouldn't trust it, and partly because I don't see the need for it, to be honest.
Well, could you explain a little bit for people who aren't familiar with how nosodes work? How do they differ then from how a vaccine works within the body?
Well, and sometimes they're called homeopathic vaccines, which
Yeah.
is really a misnomer. I mean, they are not vaccines in any shape or form. Nosodes are homeopathic remedies made from disease matter. And they will give protection. They will give some degree of protection against that disease if they're given at the time of exposure. There's been some, Christopher Day, who's a sort of the father of veterinary homeopathy in many ways, published studies years ago about using kennel cough nosodes in outbreaks in kennel cough in shelter settings, and it's very clear that they have an effect in that situation, but they don't give an antibody response. I mean, homeopathy works more on an energetic level, and somehow it prepares the animal for that disease, but it wouldn't be lasting. And it's certainly, if you take a blood test, you can't trace it. You know, there will be no antibody protection. So I would use it if there was a current exposure, you know, known current exposure. I would absolutely use it. But I wouldn't use it instead of vaccines because, you know, with the knowledge we have about vaccines these days, we can vaccinate minimally and have maximal protection.
Right. I am going to circle back to the leptospirosis thing, but I wanted to ask you really quickly as well, because this was another question that came up about the shedding of viruses. And when we might want to be concerned about, for example, if our neighbor's puppy has just had the parvovirus vaccine, for example, and how long would they be shedding it? How would we need to kind of take precautions around that? And are nosodes a useful thing in that case?
It's a really good question. And I don't know if I mean, I haven't read up on this. I've heard it discussed and I haven't read up on this. It comes up every now and then when there are family members that are on chemotherapy or suffering from HIV or something like that. But I have to say, from 30 years in clinical practice, I've never seen it be an issue. I mean, I have never seen a pup, newly vaccinated pup, infect anybody ever. So I think it's a theoretical issue rather than a real life issue. And it's certainly not one that I would worry about. It just doesn't seem to happen. That's all I can say from clinical experience.
Okay.
I don't see it.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And as you can imagine, the L2, L4, L6
Yeah.
conversation came up a lot in this community. And I'm wondering if we could actually dive into the whole leptospirosis, as well as the Bordatella question came up as well, kind of hand in hand. Can you talk about bacterial vaccines and how they differ and how we might want to think about whether or not they are appropriate for our dogs?
Yes. I mean, the kennel cough vaccines and the leptospirosis vaccines have always, by the World Small Animal Veterinary Associations, whatever that adds up to. What's that about? It's always been put firmly in the box of non-core vaccines. And the non-core vaccines have always been defined as those we should avoid because the benefit to the dog doesn't outweigh the risk. And there's two different scenarios really where that applies. The kennel cough vaccines are very clearly, I have never seen a side. Well, the only side, actually, that's not true. I occasionally see side effects from kennel cough vaccines, but it's always that they get kennel cough. There's a reasonable risk because it's a live vaccine that you end up with kennel cough from the vaccine. But kennel cough is not, kennel cough is a cold. Kennel cough is tonsillitis, maybe a flu, but it's not more than that. It's not one disease. It's a collective of upper respiratory diseases. So a dog getting kennel cough is exactly like a person getting the flu or tonsillitis or a cold. It's not dangerous unless you're 89 and have weak lungs, or you're a French bulldog and has asthma or something. They're not dangerous diseases, and the WSAVA very clearly say that it's not worth vaccinating against them because they don't work well. We can't vaccinate effectively against these upper respiratory diseases. We don't have a vaccine for people against the common flu or against tonsillitis. They're just not effective. So they recommend that you don't do it. The only reason for doing it would be if you're taking your dog to a boarding kennel or to a training class where they want you to have done it. And in that case, I'm talking about the kennel cough vaccines now. In that case, I don't worry about it because the worst that can happen is they get kennel cough. And they're probably going to get kennel cough anyway at some point, whether they're vaccinated or not. It's not a big deal, It's not worth a vaccine. It's not worth a second thought. It's a case of the common cold. They're going to, vaccinated dogs catch it. Non-vaccinated dogs catch it. There's no need to worry about it. So kennel cough, I would just forget about. Leptospirosis has sort of ended up in a bit of a gray zone. Is it a core vaccine? Is it not a core vaccine? You'll hear vets say it is now a core vaccine. The guidelines actually are not saying it's a core vaccine. They're saying that maybe they're saying the core vaccines are the three that I mentioned before: parvovirus, distemper, and hepatitis. Those are the only ones that all dogs should automatically receive. The leptospirosis conversation has maybe taken a little bit of a sort of step towards maybe in places where leptospirosis is a huge clinical problem and where we know which subtypes of leptospirosis are involved in disease and where those are present in the vaccine, it may be a good idea to give the leptospirosis vaccine again. I don't think that counts. That doesn't apply to Northern Europe for sure. It's not a widespread horrible disease. I don't know how many dogs that have become ill of leptospirosis. No, me too.
No, but I've known of dogs that have had issues as a result of the vaccines, which is
me too, for sure. Yeah. And that's always the thing, it's always a matter of understanding the situation and weighing up what am I most afraid of, the disease or the vaccine. You can get leptospirosis in the UK. It's sensitive to penicillin. So, if you catch it early, you can treat it. It doesn't have to be a deadly disease, but sometimes it is. But it's rare. It's treatable. And there is a vaccine. It exists and there is a vaccine against it, but the vaccine is not very effective. I can't even remember the number now, but there's a huge number of subtypes of leptospirosis and there's no cross protection. So you're vaccinating against 2 or 3 or 4 or 6, depending on which vaccine you use, out of nearly 100 serotypes. So lots of dogs who get leptospirosis were vaccinated in the last year. It's not an effective vaccine, and it is a vaccine that's hard on the dog. So in the WSAVA guideline version that was addressed at, I think the wording was breeders and puppy owners, that came out in 2013, they go into specific details about how they feel the owners should approach the question about whether or not to accept a leptospirosis vaccine. And they very clearly say, you know, unless you are in a local geographical area where it's rampant, don't do it. And their advice, very specifically, they're wonderfully clear in their communication. When you read these reports, they say, ask your local vet, have you personally seen many cases recently? And if it's like, no, but I've read an article, you know, that's not what we're talking about, because the vaccine is not safe enough or effective enough to recommend to everybody. That sort of weighing up of, are we more scared of the disease or of the vaccine, only really comes out in favor of the vaccine if you're, you know, if they're dropping dead around you, then maybe, yeah. But that would tend to be South America, or you know, it's not something that we see. A vaccine should be a solution to a problem, but it seems in this situation the vaccine has created a problem, because someone has a vaccine to sell and then suddenly everyone's talking about leptospirosis and worrying about leptospirosis, even those many vets, myself included, who've never seen a case. So it becomes a worry that I think is completely unnecessary. It's not something that's a huge risk to you know, lots of things can go wrong, but I wouldn't put leptospirosis highest on my list of things to worry about.
Would you say the same is probably the case then for the Lyme disease vaccines?
Yes. Those vaccines are by the experts classified as non-recommended.
Yeah. No, I think that's really helpful to hear. And actually this ties into conversations that Stacey Renfrey and I have had on the podcast in our Fetch First Friday series. But we have quite often in our group around even evaluating parasite prevention. And it's that thing of really trying to understand, what are we afraid of and what is worse? Right. And looking at what is treatable if you do happen to experience a disease state. And weighing up those risks. So I think it's helpful to kind of frame all of this as you're doing, to be able to look at, it is about weighing risks. It is about asking different questions and talking to your vet. This is one of the questions that one of our community members asked was, what should I be asking my vet in terms of what I should be doing about vaccines, particularly when I'm getting pressure about they're overdue, you know, and I'm getting the notifications that they need their annual things. And I think it's a real concern for people because you want a relationship with your vet. But if you are trying to make different choices, how would you suggest navigating that with them?
I would, if I may, can I just
Please.
mention my book, The Complete Book of Cat and Dog Health, because there's a chapter in that called Who's Your Vet? And I think that's such an important point. You need to have a working relationship with a veterinary professional that you trust. And I think vaccination and titer testing is such a nice way in, because I mean, it would be, in an ideal world, I mean, I get it. If there's something wrong with my car, I go to the local mechanic and I trust that he knows what he's doing, and I'm not really that interested. I just want the thing to work. You know, I'm not going to educate myself on to be able to assess his level of competence. And I understand the desire to trust a professional and just let them get on with it. But I would really like to just extend a heartfelt appeal to anyone caring for an animal that we don't do that, because health is complex and health is personal. And I think when we take care of, well, our own health as well, but also our children's health and that of our animals, it's just important to be well informed. And if you educate yourself first, then you're able to have that conversation and you're able to work with your vet and you're able to understand where they are in all of this. And if you have, I mean, my book is one way of doing that. And if you've decided what feels best for you in terms of, this is how I would like to deal with, like you said, parasites is the next huge big topic. What would I like to do about parasite prevention? What would I like to do about diet? What would I like to do about neutering? What would I like to do about vaccination? Then you come prepared and well informed. And if they're on a completely different wavelength and they're not interested, and they think you should have, you know, all the core vaccines plus lepto plus kennel cough plus rabies for good measure, and we should give them, you know, young, and we should repeat them blindly, then maybe it's not the right place for you to be. So I think the positive spin on a more informed, minimal approach to vaccination and on tighter testing for sure is that it's a really nice vet test. You know, if an informed progressive clinic will be offering in-house titer testing, and they will be spreading out the vaccines. And if you show up with an 8-week-old puppy and say, what do you think? What should I vaccinate against? They will say, well, initially we'll give the core vaccines only, maybe kennel cough if you feel strongly about it, but core vaccines with or without kennel cough. Let's talk next year about whether you feel that your dog should have a leptospirosis vaccine. We're definitely not going to give it to someone this young, and we're not going to give it at the same time as we're giving everything else. It's a debate for later. If you've got travel plans and your dog is going to need a rabies vaccine, hopefully they will try to discourage you if you show up with a puppy, because it's really poor timing to need to go abroad with a pup. But if it can't be helped, then if at all possible, again, try to spread out the vaccines so that you give the core vaccines and you wait as long as you possibly can before you give the rabies as an isolated shot. You know, having that awareness that let's do as little as we can and still be safe, and let's spread it out, and let's be gentle with this, you know, animal and their immune system, and make sure that they're protected, but also respect their health and have a healthy respect and not fear, that's the wrong word, that's what we don't want to have, but, you know, be aware that vaccines protect, but there's a risk that comes with that protection. You know, you gain specific protection against specific diseases, but there is a general cost to the immune system. And that's why the diseases that we vaccinate against should fulfill 2 criteria. They should be very serious diseases if you catch them, you know, life-threatening. And secondly, your lifestyle and geographical location should be such that you're at a fairly, you know, there's a risk that you'll catch them. There's no point in vaccinating against things that you're never going to meet. And there's no point in vaccinating against things that if you meet them, it doesn't really matter. Maybe you're going to get a cold, but you're not, it's not going to kill you. In those situations, it's all the risk without the benefit. And there are risks to vaccines, but if we use them carefully, the benefit can hugely outweigh the risks.
Absolutely. No, thank you for saying all that. And I think too, it's helpful to remind people as well in those conversations with your vets that you can ask, you have every right to ask and should be asking for the data sheets, for example, on any medication, but including vaccines. So you can look at, does my dog have existing factors that actually would make this a really easy decision for me to say, this is not a great thing for me to be doing for my dog, and engage your vet in that kind of a conversation as well.
Absolutely ask questions. I always say, write down, if you have questions, write down a list of questions from home, because it's so easy in the moment. You know, they have a strong opinion and time is rushed and there's dogs barking in the waiting room and everything's, you know, happening. If you have questions, I mean, I would ideally do the research from home that you're going to do, but based on that research, write down your questions, take out the list when you're there, and ideally write the answers on your piece of paper, because sometimes it's my experience, people get away and think, well, we did discuss it, but I'm not quite sure what the final answer was. If it's not understood clearly enough that you can put it down in one sentence on the piece of paper, then ask again. You know, your questions should absolutely be answered. And if the atmosphere is not good, you know, if you're not being welcomed with a list of questions, if you're not getting answers that satisfy you, I think a really good phrase is, thank you so much for your suggestions. I'm going to go home and think about it. You know, there shouldn't be any pressure in the moment to do anything. And that goes for vaccinations, it goes for booking surgeries or doing further tests or whatever it is. Make sure you understand what they're recommending, ideally write it down, and then I'm just going to go home and think about it. Is a really good one, because it's sad when, and it happens a lot, that you're vulnerable, you're worried about your animal, you're in a difficult situation, and then sometimes things happen that actually you weren't okay with. So it's just time. There are very, very few situations where time pressure is real.
Yeah,
It's much better to go home, think about it, and come back and pay for another consultation when you've thought about it
I
and are
agree.
sure that you know.
I
I think that's
agree. Because I think as well, I mean, it's a topic that doesn't get talked about enough, but I think like our intention and our energy as well around any decision that we're making has a massive impact on our animal's health. So if you're feeling unsure or conflicted or not good about the decision, that is going to have a negative impact on your dog. But if you can come from whatever decision that you're making from a place of, I'm confident in why I'm making this decision and I feel good about that from an energetic level, that is going to have a positive effect on your dog as well.
and fear. I mean, no good choice
Yeah.
was ever made
No.
from fear. And a lot of these arguments pushing things are fear-based.
Hmm.
I mean, the advertising for wormers and all that sort of stuff, it's distasteful. It's fear is not a good way to make any kind of decision, but having the information, being well informed, asking the questions, and then the end result, the end decision can actually, it can be lots of different things in lots of different situations. I was going to say there isn't always a right or wrong, but maybe it's even the rule that there isn't a right or wrong. There's lots of different choices that can be made, but what I feel very deeply is that for every person that cares for a dog or a cat or anybody, make sure that it's your decision.
Right.
There can be lots of good choices, but let it be your choices and let them be made on an informed basis. That's the best way to proceed, and not so much, what is the perfect way to put together a vaccination program. It could be lots of different ways, depending on lots of different factors, like we've talked about.
Yeah, I know. I think that's brilliant advice. And I think that applies to anything across the board when we're dealing with health, that
Mm.
there is no one right way to do anything. And if you can start to trust yourself and do the things like you're saying that help you feel that trust, is it about writing a list of questions before you go in? Is it seeing multiple vets? Right,
Yeah.
with different types of perspectives, doing a telehealth conversation with a holistic vet if you don't have one near you, all of that, whatever makes you feel good about the decision that you are ultimately making for your dog. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about as well as we kind of wrap this up is do you recommend any kind of detox protocols to kind of coincide if and when you do decide to give vaccines?
Yes, I mean, this is being a homeopath. I would always recommend that anybody who gets vaccinated, it doesn't matter whether it's humans or horses or dogs or cats, it doesn't matter what vaccines are being given. I would always, always, always give the homeopathic remedy Thuja. Thuja, Thuja. I write about this in my book. I would use a Thuja 30 or a Thuja 200. And what I tend to say is give a single dose the day before the vaccine, give them morning and night the day off the vaccine, and give an extra one just for luck on the following day. So you kind of wrap the vaccine episode in Thuja, just to protect the immune system. We know that Thuja works fantastically when we see vaccine injuries. So most homeopaths will recommend that we give it as a preventative at the time of vaccination. And there is absolutely no harm in doing that. And it almost seems reckless to me to receive a vaccine without doing that. I
Hmm.
know lots of vets who give it at the same time that they give the vaccine. Sometimes they discuss it with the owner, sometimes they just do it. But you don't even have to bring it up with your vet. You can it's a thing you can do from home. Just do it.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
And do you recommend, just as a kind of follow on from that, putting it directly as like a pellet on the dog's gums or in the
Yeah.
water or yeah, and
It doesn't really matter. I mean, the main thing is not to put it in food.
Mhm.
You can put it in the water. Simple just to put it directly in their mouth. And it doesn't matter whether it's a pill or a tablet or powder or liquid, it comes in all sorts of forms. If it's homeopathic Thuja, it'll help protect around vaccination. I mean, a couple of doses before, a couple of doses after. should really do it. If the animal is clearly affected by the vaccine, I would keep it up for longer. If you have an animal that is listless or develops a fever or swelling at the injection site, or even becomes ill enough for you to go back to the vet within the first couple of weeks after the vaccination, then I would continue a longer course of Thuya. But in those cases where you don't see that, I would just give a couple of doses before, a couple of doses after, and I would always do that to anybody receiving any vaccine.
That's really helpful advice. Thank you. Dr. Lise, is there anything else that I've not asked you about that you feel is important to make sure that listeners hear today?
I think the main thing is the titer testing. I mean, if anybody has a dog that is more than 6 months old and has never had a titer test, then I would say they're overdue. Even if you're just planning to give the puppy vaccines and leave it at that, just have the titer test to confirm that they worked. Lots of things can go wrong. Maybe the dog's immune system was a bit under the weather the day the vaccine was given. Maybe the fridge was broken at the veterinary clinic and no one noticed. I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. Lots of things could have happened.
Yeah.
But if you have that, at least one titer test, just proving that this animal responded to vaccination and is now protected, then that's what I would advise that everybody does, and then not repeat the core vaccines without titer test turning negative in the future, and they don't tend to.
Perfect.
So that will be my main advice.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to put the link to your book in the show notes as well. It's a fantastic guide for anybody that has not seen it. It's one of the top books that I recommend all the time. So if you want to, I know it's available pretty much anywhere. If you can get it at your local independent places, do that. Otherwise, you can get it on Amazon as well, but it's definitely one to have in your library for all things dogs. So, Dr. Lise, thank you so, so much for everything. You are always welcome here. Anytime you want to come on and talk about stuff, you are such a fantastic guest. I appreciate your wisdom, your time, your energy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me for my conversation with Dr. Lise Hansen. To connect with Dr. Lise and for more information on her beautiful book, The Complete Book of Cat and Dog Health, visit her website, alternative-vet.co.uk. I've left the link in the show notes. If you want some guidance on how to approach speaking with your vet about vaccinations and anything else that you have questions about, be sure to grab your copy of our free guide, Bridging the Gap, Confident Vet Conversations for Holistic Dog Guardians. It's in our new Fetch starter pack, and you can find this on our website, learnfetch.com. And if you're looking for a community of like-hearted guardians who are also walking the holistic and spiritual path with their dogs, then come join us in our Fetch First Light community on Facebook. We answer your questions, we host monthly calls, and we create resources designed to help you on your health journey with your pup. I've left that link in the show notes too. All right, until next time.